Life Matters, a Penn Mutual podcast for financial professionals, bringing you life insurance insights from advanced sales experts and life insurance specialists. Grow a stronger practice today.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Life Matters, a Penn Mutual podcast. I'm your host, Bill Bell, Vice President of Advanced Sales with Penn Mutual, and I am so pleased that you chose to join us here today. Now, most of you know I'm an attorney. I am a licensed attorney in the state of California. I took the bar exam. I pay bar dues every single year. And in fact, right now I'm wearing a shirt, for those of you that are just listening and not watching on our YouTube channel. The law school I went to, Pepperdine University, which is the finest law school in all of Malibu, California. But I'm not an attorney in the sense that I don't have clients. I don't draft documents. My job is to work with financial professionals to help them meet their clients' needs. So we decided that it was a good idea to invite on Jonathan Forster, who's with Baker Hostetler, who's really a legend in the estate planning industry, to talk about what's going on in the estate planning marketplace. Now, there's a lot of uncertainty, obviously, regarding estate planning going forward. We have potential tax reform here in 2025, a lot of other uncertainty in regards to estate planning techniques. So Jonathan's going to talk about that. He's going to talk about some of the techniques that he uses with his high net worth clients, a whole bunch of other things. I think that when you listen to this podcast, you're going to take away really some knowledge in regards to what's working out there in the estate planning marketplace. So let's get to that interview we did with Jonathan, and then I'll be back on to wrap up the show after the interview's over. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Life Matters, a Penn Mutual podcast. It's truly an honor to have you on here today.
Well, my pleasure and my privilege, and Happy New Year to you.
All right, so let's dive right into it here. So you've got a long, distinguished career as a top-notch estate planning attorney. What made you want to get into that field? Is it something that really drew you to that part of the law, or was it just sort of an accident that you wound up doing estate planning?
Well, first of all, very kind of you to say. It means a lot coming from someone with your credentials. Second, it was an interesting path, but I started my career as a portfolio manager at E.F. Hutton in the 80s when there was such a place. And from there, I was asked as a young guy to be a life insurance, basically, designer. And they said, we think this work is highly profitable, Hutton did, and we should be insourcing it. We shouldn't let these guys move that off our balance sheet. And so really it was probably the first wholesaling position. And I began, my career in part in life insurance. And at that time, the exemption amounts were about $600,000. As you can imagine, everybody and their brother needed an estate plan. So principally, I was involved in estate planning matters.
So, a couple of interesting things there. My first boss in the life insurance industry used to work in the mailroom at E.F. Hutton Life before he went to law school and then became an advanced planning attorney. So I think that there's a lot of people in our industry that had their start at E.F. Hutton Life. I heard a rumor that when E.F. Hutton talks, people listen, but I might be dating myself with that one.
I'll tell you, it's amazing 50 years later or more, and people still remember that slogan. They should have kept that name and that slogan, but they got into a whole bunch of hot water.
Yeah, incredible marketing. Well done by then. So you already hit on one of the things that I was going to ask you about here, but obviously we've seen a lot of changes from an estate planning perspective. What would you say the biggest changes are from your perspective, other than just the fact that the exemption used to be $625,000 and now it's roughly $14 million?
Well, obviously, from a technical standpoint of who's eligible for estate planning services, it's the upper stratosphere as opposed to a much broader base of people. But I think, Bill, if you want to know really what's I see changing is not so much, the technical aspects. Those are constantly evolving. Valuation, sort of a hot topic today. You got DiMatteo and a series of intergenerational split dollar cases, and recently Connolly, et cetera. Clearly, the IRS is hot on the path of valuation matters, principally because they got their proposed regulations dumped back in the day when Trump took over the first time. So technically, I think there's, an evolution occurring, and principally it's around these days, valuation matters. From the standpoint of service delivery, I think that's about to change significantly. I think, the idea of having sort of episodic and transactional estate planning services from counsel and others is going by the way of the dinosaur, if you ask me. I think people are starting to recognize that the process is too siloed. Every advisor stays in their lane, that it's too transactional, that there's no continuity. They're not sure what they should be doing after all the parties leave, what kind of maintenance and supervision there should be. And then I guess, lastly, because, and this is part of things that your firm and other firms are talking about, people aren't just living longer, they're living more independent, active lives longer. Here I am in Florida, and I can tell you, like, I played golf with a group of people last season. Some of them were in their 90s. One guy was 93, and he told me that what he was planning on doing for the summer was taking his family to Southeast Asia, 3 generations of them, and going to, Thailand, Singapore, etc. And so I think that also plays a role in estate planning, because people are saying it's not estate planning so much, it's more experiences that I want to have to share with my family. So it's sort of this box of shared experiences. And when you take that and layer on, technology like artificial intelligence and the like, I think there's going to be a huge sea change in the delivery model of this practice.
Yeah, I would agree. There's a lot to unpack there and a lot of great insights. I definitely see a lot of change in regards to what's a senior now? What do we consider a senior citizen these days? I think when I was a kid, you thought senior citizen 65. I'm going to be 52 years old here pretty soon. I don't think of myself being close to being a senior citizen, but then when I think back to what my dad was like at my age, he very much was in that category. In fact, he stopped working before he was 55 because his body just couldn't take it anymore. I think that just lifestyle changes and our ability to access information and healthcare is going to change a lot of how people are living going forward. And I think that it's going to make the things that you do that much more important, because not only protects assets for the future, but it also provides flexibility now so people can do what they want to do.
I think that's right. I think if you ask people what they want to do with their resources, they don't come to me and say, listen, I want to die and optimize the financial outcome. What they're saying, usually what they would like to do is experience the joy of moving those resources and offer their own guidance and sort of stewardship over them. Because if you ask most successful people what they're concerned about chiefly is responsible, productive, non-trust reliant children. And so in order to get that result, you might have to be around to sort of orchestrate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, speaking of maximizing the financial impact, we're kind of in a little bit of a holding pattern here, because for those of you that are listening a little bit behind the curtain, we're recording this in January. At this point here, we know that we're just days away from a new administration. I think the new Congress is being sworn in any day now. I think that a lot of us were thinking that we would probably be looking at a potential sunset of some of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act provisions that affect estate planning, or at least a consideration of that. Now that we have a Republican trifecta, chances of that happening are probably not great. What's your opinion in regards to kind of where we wind up from a tax reform standpoint, specifically when it comes to the transfer tax exemption? Do you think that the most likely outcome is that they just extend out the law that's in place today, or do you think that they go somewhere else with it?
I mean, obviously everybody's crystal ball may show something different on this front. I think the challenge here is going to be wrestling with the notion of tax relief for wealthy people in particular. And at the same time, figuring out how you get serious about managing our deficit. And those are hugely competing interests, and they're kind of on a collision course. I mean, we're not far away from having, and maybe it's already there. I don't study this as carefully as maybe I should, but maybe the largest line item on our budget these days could be servicing our debt. And at some point, if, gross receipts equal debt service, we could arguably be insolvent, which is a bad spot to be in. So I think with that backdrop, there's only so many things you can do. That being said, if you keep the estate tax laws where they are, coupled with a peg, and an index for inflation, if you really think about it, it's probably the closest thing to repeal one can get. Every year you're layering on well into six figures onto an already heightened exemption amount. At some point, it's sort of rarefied air. And at some point, somebody may scratch their head and say, we're basically creating an entire group of people to manage and administer and enforce these rules that apply to 2% of the overall population. Do we keep doing this? And so I don't know. If you ask me, it's probably going to stick as to what we have. I don't really think there'll be any change there, is my guess.
Yeah, I think that that's the most likely outcome too. I've heard some other people say that they might go back to a lower number and start fresh as far as the indexing goes, like a 7 or a 9, with the intention of trying to make that permanent. But I think that it's still most likely that they just say, okay, well, we've got a pretty good deal here. This is something that Republicans can live with. I think that the Democrats obviously would like to push it much lower, but I just don't see that happening. But at this point, we have to throw our hands up because the margins in the House are so small.
They're razor thin.
Yeah, it's going to be 2 seats, maybe 3 seats, depending on how special elections come out. You're going to basically have to have unanimous Republican support because you're not going to get any Democrat support. Let's face it, it's just going to be the Republicans that are going to be driving this. And they're going to say, all right, here it is. And if 2 people stand up and say, hey, I don't like this because of the deficit, or I don't like this because of this provision, then they have to go back to the drawing board. So it's going to be a really interesting process to watch.
That's where I think the rubber is going to meet the road is we need to find money if you want to do this. And then the question is kind of where.
Yeah, very much so. One last thing kind of from a broad estate planning, estate tax perspective. One of the things that I think that a lot of people really struggle with when they're talking about true estate planning and specifically about the estate tax is it really does not matter what the estate tax is today. Obviously, it's important for us from a gifting perspective and so forth. But the estate tax itself, it only really matters what the estate tax is when you die. And when you're talking about planning for people that are in their 40s, 50s, 60s, even 70s, you're potentially looking at 5 or 6 potential tax laws coming into place. In fact, in some cases, even more in between when an estate plan is put in place and that person's death. How do you get clients to understand that? Because, I mean, I've been in this industry now for roughly 25 years, a little bit less. We've had 6 major tax law changes just since the beginning of this century. I'm assuming that we're probably going to be on kind of a every 4-year cycle going forward here. How do you get clients to understand that estate taxes, the law really matters when you die, and so you just have to plan kind of the best that you can with flexibility built into the plans to make sure that if something changes, you have the ability to change the planning?
So I think that's a really good comment and a really insightful comment. I'd say principally, this goes back to what I was arguing for earlier, which is if people are implementing in a way where there's a disciplined cadence to their planning, meaning every year, almost like, somebody gets a health checkup, they sit with their advisory team and go through directionally where things are heading, because nothing happens overnight. These things usually evolve and build up steam. And so I think, 2 things. If you use a model that is akin to what I sort of discussed earlier, and in addition to your point, you implement structures that are flexible. The shadow side of flexibility, Bill, as you well know, is for every door you create to get out, it arguably swings the other way and somebody can come in. So to the extent that you allow for, quote, non-reciprocal reciprocal trusts, or you create a co-trustee out of a descendant who may even have unilateral control over certain types of distributions, you kind of move the meter towards aggressive planning. At least as the IRS is concerned, it's sort of like, hey, wait a minute, this looks like Bill never gave up control. He certainly has a lot to say about these assets he supposedly parted company with. And, when you think about it, all these areas and then the great unknown of decanting, which people have gotten super hot and bothered about. I mean, you got clients that decant trusts, 5, 6, 7 times over the course of their lives. If I'm the IRS, I'm sort of scratching my head saying, what's irrevocable about all this? And then some states like Delaware kind of even parse it finer. They say, well, there's decanting, there's judicial, there's non-judicial, so you don't even have to go to court. And then there's a modification. Like, we don't even think that's a true decanting. Like, you don't have to tell anybody. You just go ahead and change it if you'd like. And you sort of say, all right, so again, with all this flexibility, the shadow side is, you might be compromising some of your planning. So I think the importance here is going to be talking to clients on a regular basis. And also, where do you fall on the risk meter? Ultra conservative or middle road, or, hey, man, I'll take any chance you give me as long as I understand it. I think that's going to count.
I think so too. Well, let's get a little more granular here. So let's assume that I'm a high net worth person and I come into your firm and I say, Jonathan, I'm worth 50 million, $100 million, whatever the number might be. And I say, I'm looking to put together an estate plan. What should I do? And now, of course, the answer is always going to be, well, it depends, because that's the favorite lawyer answer that everybody hates. And of course, it depends. But what would be some of the planning techniques that you would be looking at for somebody, a high net worth person, maybe some highly appreciated assets, possibly even like a closely held business that they might want to move outside of their balance sheet from an estate tax perspective?
So I think to your point, of course, it does depend. I think what you want to start with is, almost like the famous Stephen Covey comment is, start with the end in mind. And what is it you want to accomplish? Is it optimizing a financial outcome? Is it ensuring the transition of a business from point A to point B? Or is it, there's a certain amount of resources I'm comfortable leaving my children, and after that, it's enough. And so kind of those end up being your guardrails. Back in my Hutton days, if you told me, Bill, I want to retire with X amount of dollars, $500,000 a year when I'm 65, like we reverse engineer, what do you need to save to produce, maybe $10 million in that case to do that with. And so I think you do want to start with that, in mind. I say all of that. And I think, also what it depends on is what wealth category are you in and what are the asset classes? So if I'm $50 million, no one's going to say, optimize my exemption, create parallel, slats, and sort of like half my net worth is off my balance sheet. That's sort of a bold step. On the other hand, you could be worth $300 million, but if your company is producing your income and the company is, let's just say, an LLC, and you're, let's say, a fairly significant consumer, you may not be able to move as much in the way of resources if you want to move that company off your balance sheet. So you sort of have to get granular, to your point, with what do you want to do and how are you living? What is your consumption rate? And what assets are driving your lifestyle requirements? I say all of that, and as you know, I'm a big fan of life insurance, always have been. I mean, obviously I was, doing this work back in the day, so to speak. It's what older guys like to say. And all estate planning, when you look at it stepping back, is some form of, let's call it, wealth transfer. And the question then is, what does the wealth transfer technique require? If it's a GRAT, it requires mortality, right? Which I can't predict. I need longevity. If it's an installment sale, it needs to meet a certain arbitrage over time, meaning I'm counting on market-based success and probably longevity. And so all the tools usually require market success over a long haul and longevity, two things you have absolutely zero control over. So if you're looking to perform some kind of wealth transfer tax, then you say to yourself, well, maybe then I have to sort of diversify my approaches. Maybe I have a couple of grats, but the ages are different or the time terms. I do an installment sale, but I overlay the whole thing with life insurance because it's not correlated to any of those things. If I pay one premium and die the very next day, I'm getting the benefit of my bargain. And maybe if I use even a guaranteed product, it doesn't matter what interest rates or the stock market are doing, whether they're performing well or not, I still get the benefit of my bargain. And so I think, just looking at, regardless of wealth category, life insurance probably has a home in all circumstances if you want to hedge out those two risks that you otherwise have no control over.
Yeah, we'll get more into life insurance here in just a second, but there are a couple of things that I wanted to follow up on in regards to that answer, which was terrific, by the way. First of all, in this higher interest rate environment, and I say higher interest rates in regards to what it's been over the last, say, decade or so, is it more difficult to plan given that we have a higher 75/20 rate and higher AFRs? Or is it just kind of something that you plan around? You have to build in some padding in regards to if interest rates go up? Or how do you deal with this kind of higher interest rate environment when you're putting these leverage plans together these days?
So I think when you're looking at interest rates, historically, they're probably at the right spot as opposed to, quote, high or low. And I think you can, again, get more granular if you work as a multidisciplinary team. And I'll give you an example. I was working with a group from one of the major banking institutions. We were having this very conversation. I guess, Gratz no more. And he started telling me that he was layering onto this particular client's portfolio structured notes that his own firm was sort of a counterparty to. And I said, what are the rates? And he said, 7%. And I said, could we layer those into, a grat? And he said, I don't see why not. I said, well, then I have my arbitrage. And if we mix it in with partially a portfolio, maybe there's even some hedging there if the market goes up further. And so I think, you can play that game with, the right asset classes. And again, going back to my comment earlier, active management. I mean, grats are just nothing more than a financial arbitrage, and you're purely guessing. You have no idea what's going to transpire over multiple years. And so the best thing you can do is actively monitor and manage using things like, powers of substitution, regratting the annuity, which is effectively dollar cost averaging down if you're a market person. You can do all kinds of financial tricks, and treats, and whatever you want to call them, but you can actively manage for income if that's what you're proposing to do. So I think you can manage into that.
And then the second question, how does charitable planning come into play when you're dealing with these high net worth individuals? Do you see a lot of these people setting up private foundations? Are donor advised funds part of the mix? Is it just straight charitable planning as far as gifting, either during lifetime or at death? How does that come into play for the right client?
So I think, charitable planning, frankly, oftentimes the catalyst is some income tax event. I'm about to leave. I'm a public company executive. I'm getting a lump sum on departure of $30 million. I'm about to exit my business. Part of it is ordinary income. It's a service business, and there might be a 338 election, et cetera. So there's going to be a high income tax on the way out. And so depending on what the catalyst is, and if you're really truly ready, is sometimes the dictator of that approach. So category one, I'm not so charitably inclined, but I like the tax deduction part. So then you might say, well, maybe a grantor charitable lead trust. You kind of get a little bit of everything. You get your immediate income tax deduction. You're really doing a wealth transfer at the same time. So it's not there is some private enormement here for those who are not heavily charitably motivated. The next area may be, I'm highly charitably motivated. I want an active role. I want I want to be able to do things like run scholarship programs. I need something to do when I'm done selling this business. And I want to have a succession plan, and I want to have a training ground for my kids. Well, that's probably more of a foundation. There's obviously more guidelines, there's more structure, but maybe that's what you're looking for relative to family and relative to yourself. Then if you are absolutely philanthropic, truly philanthropic, but you really don't know what the heck you want to do, you're just motivated because there's a tax event and you want to kind of get it done, a donor advised fund is a great way to kind of execute quickly, get your immediate tax deduction. Of course, Congress is belly aching about this, but there's no requirement that any charitable distributions take place anytime soon. You can kind of hold back, and you can even play a couple of these strategies. A charitable lead trust could fund a foundation, or a foundation could fund a DAF. So you can layer them on, but I think, back the question is, what are you trying to accomplish? And then, we'll go in there. But the two ends of the spectrum to me are charitable lead annuity trust, because it gives you a little bit of both, probably a CRAT as well, or a CRUT, because that creates an income for yourself. And then the other sleeve would be foundation and DAF. I'm purely charitable, have no interest in having this capital, et cetera.
All right, let's get back to life insurance. So you're uniquely positioned to answer this question because you've been on both sides of this conversation, I'm sure. You used to work for a life insurance company. You've been an estate planning attorney for a long time. Probably 3 or 4 times a year, I'll get a call from a financial professional and say, hey, I'm working with a client and I'm having a real tough time working with their attorney because the attorney either doesn't believe in life insurance or they just think that they can document the problem away in regards to estate planning. How do you work with financial professionals so that they know that that's not going to be an issue, that you want life insurance to be part of that? And what advice would you give to financial professionals that do run into that situation? Because I think it's more common than a lot of people think.
No, it's extremely common. I mean, I've been at, 2 major law firms during my career, and I can tell you both of them had very large, private client practices, 50 and north in terms of individual professionals. I can also tell you that you could count on half of one hand the number that had dealt with life insurance matters. I mean, significant, split dollar, intergenerational split dollar. Many of them actually thought split dollar was dead and is no longer even viable to this day. And so part of it is there's just not been the type of training in the legal space as there probably should have been. And unfortunately, the handful of us that are left are not getting any younger. And, then the question becomes, who involves, because that's really critical. It's really important that you have professionals that are simpatico with your planning. Otherwise, it's really, a huge headwind to get things done. So number one, but again, you walk into a case, Bill Bell's the lawyer, no disrespect to Bill, but he hates life insurance. He never saw a life insurance case he liked, doesn't even like the industry, thinks it's too much. And so then I guess to my mind, at least, you talk to the client about what I said before. Listen, there's a diversification of these tools, no different than there's a diversification of your portfolio. You don't want to rely on any one tool to produce the result you want, right? I mean, you have no idea what the market's going to do, to your point, over 4 decades. You have no idea if you're going to outlive the terms on this series of GRATs or charitable lead trusts, which all will not only come back into your estate, but with the charitable lead annuity trust, you'll also reverse the income tax and you'll owe dollars and cents. And so this really offsets all of those planning modes, number one. Number two, if you are highly liquid, it does not matter. If you passed away in 2007 and had to pay with 2008 or 2009 dollars that tax bill, you paid with 50-cent dollars and the market's probably gone up 400% since that date and time. So you really pay. You paid more estate tax than maybe anybody I know. You paid 400% on that nugget. And so I would tell you that liquidity is always king. You never know what's around the corner. You never know when markets are going to change. And you should make sure you have some liquidity available, regardless of what you think the circumstances are relative to this moment in time. And that's usually the conversation I have.
So our friend life insurance is that liquidity provider when you do need those dollars. I think that that's a well thought out answer. So thank you for that. I do have a couple of other questions before we wrap up here. Now, obviously, you're generally working with a lot of high net worth individuals. In fact, I think you probably only work with high net worth individuals. But we like to tell people, and I like to tell my friends, hey, you don't necessarily have an estate tax problem, but you still need to do some level of estate planning. I think that a lot of people out there are walking around, and it's shocking to me that I'll talk to one of my friends and say, hey, do you have a will in place? Do you have a living trust? Do you have an advanced healthcare directive? Do you have a power of appointment for your financial decisions? And they'll say, well, no, I don't have any of those things. Why is it so important that everybody think about kind of at least a baseline of estate planning documents? And why do you think people put off doing that until, in some cases, it's just too late?
Well, nobody likes to think of themselves as passing away. Everybody thinks they're going to pass away in the same manner. I'm going to be 92. I'll be surrounded by family. It'll be the end. I'll give you an example of a guy who I know quite well. In 2010, I was out for a jog that morning. It was the third leg. You travel a lot. It was the third leg of a business trip. I was now in Indiana, of all places. And I was in the suburbs of Indiana, in a town called Carmel. And I was meeting with a group of, just so happens, life insurance executives. I didn't feel well that morning. I'll fast forward that story, but bottom line was, and I'd never been sick a day in my life. I was having what's called an aortic dissection. My aorta was separating from my heart. I was actually bleeding to death. I had 4 hours to either get fixed or call it quits. Ended up with 9 hours of open heart emergency surgery. Again, I had never been in the hospital since I was born and rarely ever had a sick day, but had this latent issue that I didn't know anything about. And so you never know when that moment is going to arrive. Then, of course, you're thinking about the condition of your finances and other things, not the time to be thinking about that. And so, planning covers a number of things, and it gets crystallized at that moment, of course. Does my family have enough? What are my obligations? How do I want my children treated, etc. Regardless of whether you're worth 10 million or 100 million, people care. And I think, you have to kind of categorize, how do I care and what are my needs? But maybe liquidity is a need at that juncture. Maybe I got to make sure that my spouse is well resourced. Maybe my kids have not yet gone to college, etc. Or maybe I even have super wealthy parents, but the way their personal estate plan is structured is it's lineal descendants. So if I pass away, my wife will be fortunate to have very wealthy kids, but she might have nothing. And so there's just odd dynamics going on that you want to crystallize and decide whether you want to solve for them, but at least crystallize them first.
Yeah, well, you shared a personal story. I'll share one myself. In 2013, my mother was diagnosed with dementia, and having the fact that she had the power of attorney for financial decisions and the advanced healthcare directive wound up be so important, because I could call up her bank and I could make sure that all her financial decisions were made for her. When it came time at the end, we had an advanced healthcare directive for her. My friend put those documents together for her, because before my dad had passed away, I basically sat them both down and said, you need to do this. And if they had done that, then it becomes much more difficult to manage for somebody that's in that particular position. So I think that if anybody's listening and they don't have those basic documents put in place, consider doing so soon. Because, we talk about estate planning all the time in regards to estate taxes. But for most of us, estate taxes are not an issue. But having that will, having that advanced healthcare directive, having that power of attorney, that's going to affect most of us at some point. And I think that having those documents in place is just critically important. And so if you're listening and you take one thing away from this podcast, that would be what I would urge you to do so.
And to put a fine point on it, Bill, because I think that's a very, very important point that you make, is how do you want to leave your family? I mean, if they're scrambling, they're already devastated by your loss, and they now can't figure out or piece together your finances, or things are out of order. That's a really tough spot for somebody to be in at that particular time.
Absolutely. All right. We're going to shift gears as much as you can shift gears here, because that was obviously a very serious conversation. We like to end these podcasts with some fun questions. The first one that I have for you is, obviously we don't want to name any names, but is there one case that you've worked on where it just sticks out in your mind because the facts were so wacky, or the people that were just so wacky, that you'll just never forget working with that family as long as you live?
There are a number of those. I've been told I could probably publish a book on this. Quite a few.
All right, well, just pick one and maybe share a little bit of some of what you deal with on a day-to-day basis.
I would say that people get very wrapped up in what do they want to do for their kids, or what do they not want to do for their kids. And probably the most extreme situation I had a very wealthy client that decided, I'm not interested in what you have to say, John. I hear you. I get it. I dismiss it. I'm moving on. And so he was insistent on having, so-called W-2 matchers for distribution rights for these kids. Of course, as luck would have it, one child was literally a Wall Street banker with a very large 7-figure income, and the other child was a public school teacher. And you can only imagine how this worked. And in addition, he insisted, because of that structure, which philosophically it probably made sense, it should be a pot trust, meaning not separate sleeves. So the person who's getting more will literally get more, not half. And this thing began getting completely consumed. And these two went into litigation over this whole thing against one another, and then threw me out, basically saying I was riddled with conflicts, gave bad advice, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so it was just, frankly, all-consuming to watch this go on. I've got lots of other stories, but that one kind of sticks out in my mind because I was stuck in it for a number of years. The other place I would tell you, Bill, and I tell you, the audience, this to sort of seller beware, I've now been involved in 6 pretty scathing, scorched earth divorce processes where spousal access trusts were in the middle. And I saw some pretty divisive activity where, to the point, I had one spouse liquidate a huge portfolio of assets only to create an enormous tax consequence to the other side. Literally said, if you don't do what I want, I'm pulling the and did so. So, just since I know spousal access trusts are hot on the market, you may want to be pretty cautious about how you deal with those things. It can create your own story that you might be telling, Bill.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Last question for you. What clears the room faster? Telling somebody that you sell life insurance, or telling somebody that you're an estate planning attorney?
I think probably the latter.
I agree, by the way.
Nobody, at least, usually people that are in sales are charming and funny. Like the minute they hear this is what you do. I used to say to people, I might as well be selling coffins or headstones or something. It's just a terrible thing to tell people.
Yeah, double that up and just tell people you're an estate planning attorney that works for a life insurance company, and you'll have no friends at a party unless you're super, super charming. So I've had that experience in the past where somebody asked me what I do, and then within 30 seconds, it's like, oh, excuse me, let me take this phone call type of thing.
I gotta go.
Yeah, exactly right. Hey, Jonathan, thank you so much for the insights. Really, really poignant, really timely information. It is a real honor to have you on the podcast. I've got a tremendous amount of respect for you. We've known each other for a long time, but I think that we're going to continue to work pretty closely together here on a number of things going forward. And I'm really excited about that. But I think that everybody that's listening here today is going to have a lot of aha moments listening to what you had to say. So thank you so much for being on this episode of Life Matters, a Penn Mutual podcast.
Well, Bill, thank you very much. You're obviously an icon in the industry yourself. And as I said before, coming from you, those kind comments, mean an awful lot. And I appreciate Penn Mutual allowing me to participate in this program. They've been obviously out front in the marketplace, very impressive group of people. I don't know anybody, honestly, working much harder than you all.
Well, thank you for that. All right. Well, hey, looking forward to seeing what's coming here in 2025. And we'll probably have you on here in 2026 or sometime beyond to give an update on where we are from a transfer tax perspective and what's going on in estate planning. So again, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Johnny.
Well, thank you so much to Jonathan. What a great interview. Jonathan, I said it earlier when I introed the episode, he really is a legend in the estate planning marketplace. Somebody that's got a big reputation out there, both in the attorney and financial professional community. Plus, he's just a great guy. So really thought that he had a lot of great insights. I learned a lot. Hope you did as well, too. If you have any questions for me or for Jonathan or anybody associated with the show, you can drop us an email anytime at lifematters@pennmutual.com. Again, that's lifematters@pennmutual.com. That's a special mailbox that only I have access to. So drop us an email. I do respond to every single email that is sent to that mailbox. If you haven't checked out the show on our YouTube channel, please do so. Just go to YouTube, type in the search bar, Penn Mutual. Our channel will pop up. All the episodes of Life Matters, a Penn Mutual podcast, are there, and subscribe to the show today. And make sure to like the episode because that helps with the YouTube algorithmic overload to make sure that you boost visibility of the show. Also, if you haven't subscribed to the show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever podcasting app you use, make sure you do so today so you don't miss future episodes of the show on those applications. Finally, if you are a subscriber on Apple Podcasts, please stop by today if you haven't done so already and leave us a review. It only takes a few seconds to do a star review. 5-star reviews help to boost visibility of the show on the Apple Podcasting app. And if you take a few additional seconds to write a written review, I'll be your best friend. So for Jonathan Forster, I'm Bill Bell. Thank you so much for joining us here today, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update.